Welcome back to No Invitation Required. I'm your host of No Invitation, and your voice of reason, Brooks the Fair. And tonight with me is my co-host Faith Eatman, lead moderator for the Bias Rehab Center.
Hi,
Now,
everybody.
yes, welcome. Now, before we get started, feel free to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Remember, 30% of our profits from YouTube are donated to nonprofits that empower the Black community. So you're not just following Bias Rehab, you are helping to educate children, you're funding Black-owned tech companies, and you're helping to feed communities. Whether you're watching on your Apple TV or your computer, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. Stay tuned to the end when we read questions submitted for our controversial segment, Ask a Black Person. Tonight's episode has been generously supported by the Beyond Normal podcast. Our guest for this evening is the Bias Rehab resident professor, Dr. Harriet Lewis, PhD, of Conesis Development. Is that correct?
It's Connaissance Development.
Conesis. I never get the long and the short vowels. Dr. Harriet has over 25 years experience in furthering inclusion and equity during her career as a research management consultant. As a nonprofit executive with organizations that serve refugees and immigrants, high-risk youth, survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, returning citizens, and small business owners, she has spoken at international forums on topics of equity and inclusion. And she just launched an online online course, Encouraging Equity, a primer. All right. Now, which brings us to our first question, our first subject, our topic for today. The false hierarchy of human value that's found in white supremacy. Now, Doctor, can you tell us a little bit about your ideas of white supremacy and the why someone should move beyond the idea of this hierarchy of human value in order to be inclusive?
Wow, that's a great question. And I hear a little feedback. Is that me? The false hierarchy of human value. So, I push back a little bit. We've been using the word, we hear a lot about the word, white supremacy. I often, when I'm talking about white supremacy, I typically say the system of white supremacy. I don't like to talk about white supremacy or use the phrase like that because it's loaded and it creates different images, and that idea of supremacy is false, as well as the idea of white is false when we actually look at how the false hierarchy came into existence. Which came into existence, it's something that was created. This idea of hierarchy as it relates to the color of our skin was something that was created. It's something that did not exist. We're talking about, the 1700s, 18th century. This was during a time when you had taxonomists, who were developing, they were labeling species. And during this period, Europeans were labeling species. There was someone by the name of Carl Linnaeus. And he was probably there were a couple of people doing this, his contemporaries who were labeling people. And he started labeling people by color. And when he labeled Europeans, Asians, indigenous, American Indians, or I said indigenous, and African, people of African descent. And with each quote unquote subgroup of species of human beings, he labeled a particular characteristic. And I have these papers with me. I'm not going to go through and flip through the papers of how he labeled, but basically the more pleasing characteristics of intelligence, of beauty, of tolerance, and as far as someone's personality and characteristics, he labeled those. Again, it was on a hierarchy. and basically the person of African descent had the worst characteristics amongst the different races, quote unquote races of people. And so this this idea of this hierarchy of characteristics, as false hierarchy of human value that was developed during this time, it became popular. We call this, this was a pseudoscience during this time. People were trying to attribute, they were measuring, you know, you could see history measuring brains and things like that, and trying to attribute, we see that this particular brain of this particular population is different than this one, so therefore there must be some type of superiority. And different race people with racist motivations, utilize that to justify, their policies, specifically as it related to the United States, the system of the enslavement of African people. And so
Now, is
that's
that
how it came. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know you're on a roll. Just to get some clarification, there's a lot going on in what you just said, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to understand what you just said. So basically, a type of there was a specific word you used at the beginning that I can't remember now. But you're saying that somebody literally measured the brain and sat and studied and measured the sizes and decided that the characteristics of a black people or brown people was
it
less
taxonomy that you said?
Yes, I was
taxonomy.
saying that the taxonomists during that time period, they did lots of things, this pseudoscience, and even, up into, we're talking about eugenics, and you're talking about, people were differentiating of this particular group of the human species between that group of the human species. And we're all the human species, we're 99% the same, but for whatever reasons, typically it was financially motivated, to justify the system of the enslavement of people around the world and the colonization of people around the world. That's why this took hold. I want to say this because the system of white supremacy that exists today, it was something that was created. That's the main thing that I'm getting at here. This, this creation of race, this creation of the races that we still use today, that we check off boxes, on our census and things like that. It was something that was created, and the characteristics that are connected to these identities that we use in our society is something that was created. And this system of white supremacy that came from that, that system of slavery that was justified because of this, these characteristics that were attributed to people, that led to, of course, we know, Jim Crow laws and black codes and all of this that we've experienced, and where we are today, still trying to fight for equity and equality. That this is a system that can be eradicated. To get to my point, the system that can be eradicated because it was something that was created. Sometimes when we just say white supremacy, we throw it out there. It's almost as if we can't do anything about it, but we can.
That's deep. So I recently heard that somebody had a gentleman back then, a very, very fairly known gentleman, literally had a room full of skulls and was measuring them and categorized. Is that true? Faith says yes.
A lot of different people. I'm not sure of the person you were speaking of, but there are a lot of different quote unquote researchers during that time period to justify why that they would treat particular people a specific way, or specific people a particular way. That even as recent as the 1990s, as recent as the 2000s, pseudoscientific books to justify people's racist ideologies that are pretty popular, actually.
You said pseudoscientists a lot. How does somebody identify, because I'm realizing now, as you say pseudoscientists, there's chiropractors, and sometimes people say, oh, that's not a real doctor. And then some people say dentist is not a real doctor. So how does an ordinary person identify what is a pseudoscience versus what is real science?
That's a great question. And when I'm using the term pseudoscientist, I'm utilizing it in the way that people have utilized. They have an ideology of racism. They're going to say that we're going to justify the system of slavery
Mhm.
against this population of people, and we're going to say it because of their skin, they should be treated this way, and because their brain is smaller, according to what I see in my bias that I have as I'm looking at this data that may or may not even be. As a matter of fact, Carl Linnaeus, and others like him, they didn't even travel. They didn't even leave their country yet. They created this ideology or this classification of people and attributed characteristics to them and didn't even leave their countries. So that's what I'm talking about as far as pseudosciences.
So they've never seen them.
Never seen them, never, and again, and the way that um they were able to quote unquote attribute these characteristics to them, they would read the stories of the enslavers, the logs of the enslavers as they were transporting people, and they read this and say, okay, this person has this characteristic and that person has that characteristic. And then again, this ideology was adopted in this country and other countries.
So it's really like it kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg? But in this case, like it was slavery, enslaved people that came first, and they wanted to decide like how can we justify this? So like let's figure out a way to justify what we're doing. Okay. And started thinking about, oh yeah, their brains are smaller, or just like looking for things to try to justify what they had already done to maintain a system of power.
And Carl Linnaeus, he literally said, as far as people of African descent, crafty and sly, governed by caprice, lustful, careless, cunning, all of these negative attributes. Therefore, and again, think about that. Lustful, careless, sly, crafty, these attributes that are attributed to someone who needs to be controlled. You already have this negative
Mm.
perception of this person, and just add propaganda with that, and then just add black codes with that, just add a penal system to that, and here we are today.
So now we're
that.
basically doing God's work, right? By controlling, by enslaving and controlling and keeping these people under control.
Oy vey.
Interesting.
Okay. So because the main objective of the show, I'm still a little bewildered by the fact that they didn't even go. I just somehow assumed that they went there and maybe like measured people, but I guess not.
Over time, there were scientists that again did this, were measuring people and justifying whatever their belief was tied to, skulls. Or even like the name Caucasian, that was attributed, to someone who it was actually, what was it? It was actually, again, it was a skull, and they liked the shape of this skull. And because they like the shape of the skull, it must be a European skull, and Europeans will now be called, or people of white complexion will now be called Caucasian.
So even like when we are, I don't generally use the term Caucasian, but I do know people who use it. So like when we're using those terms, like we are perpetuating white supremacy, even in that, and just using the term Caucasian.
That's crazy. I literally just had a conversation on Alpha where somebody posted that they whether Asians were people of color. And a bunch of people had responded, and the very first thing I said was, remember, even the idea of race is a product of white supremacy, and somebody else's idea of how to rank individuals by their skin color. I said we're all the human race, and by categorizing us, what he's really looking for is an excuse to be mean to mean to people who are outside his race. So he's trying to figure out, how mean can I be? And that's crazy. So, doctor, yes. Please tell us, how does somebody let go of this? How can they if they have this feeling of superiority or hierarchy, how can they get rid of that or what can they do to be more inclusive?
And you know, that's all of us. All of us have been impacted by this system, by this racist system, this system of white supremacy. And we all have to work to unlearn it. And I'm saying, you know, all of us, not just white people in the United States, but Black people, Latinx people, all of us need to unlearn that. And we have to have conversations like this. We have to read. We have to have conversations. We have to be open to learning. We have to take the time to connect with other people. We've seen the statistics that most people, when they do connect to diversity, especially specifically as we're talking about white Americans, do not come in contact with other people of color outside of the workplace as far as genuine relationships and or living in communities with other people of color. The majority of 80% of white people live in communities or work in spaces that are predominantly white and typically do not have relationships that are meaningful. And when it comes to Black and Latinx and Asian populations, they do work and live in more diversity, more diverse settings. That's for a myriad of reasons, but because we're, you know, upward mobility or better schools and things like that. So we put ourselves in spaces that are not as segregated. So I would say the first thing is just being on, watching this YouTube channel right now, watching the show right now, taking the time, the extra time to listen, to learn, and to read, and to connect, and then find ways to connect with your colleagues or other people that you may encounter and develop genuine relationships. And another thing, if we are the person, so that's for the person who wants to unlearn. And then for the person who may be on the receiving end, we have to provide grace and understanding that we're all on this journey. We're all on this journey. We've all been miseducated, and we all have biases, not only towards other groups, but even as I'm speaking about just even African Americans. Some of us, I think there's a statistic, 30% of African Americans also hold bias, against Blacks. And again, because we're all unlearning this. So really just connecting, taking the time to connect and then develop allies.
So can we just, I don't know how much time we have, but can we take a step back and just talk about how does white supremacy show up? Like at work or just in kind of everyday situations because I think sometimes when people think about, just as you say, we don't want to think about white supremacy itself, but think about the system of white supremacy. Because sometimes when you think about white supremacy, you think oh, they're not talking to me. I'm not walking around with a hood and a Confederate flag or, whatever. I'm not into that. So you're not talking to me. I'm obviously not a white supremacist, but as you say, we all can perpetuate white supremacy, the system of white supremacy. So what does that look like? What can that look like?
Oh my God, that is such a loaded question, such a huge question, but a great question because it shows up everywhere. It's like air. It shows up in our schools. It shows up in bail bonds. It's in our war on poor people. It shows up in I'm going to give this person, I'm going to hire or give this person a raise because she looks like she might be more qualified, or she whatever the reason is, typically tied to our and again, depending on who the person is. It depends, if the person who's controlling another person's promotion, who maybe happen to be white, it shows up in that promotion for another person who looks like them, or that that sponsorship, or that internship, or that accolade, or that raise, or it may be a raise for two people, but I don't think this person deserves a raise, or I don't think that person deserves as much money. I don't think that person necessarily, years ago, it looked like, I don't think this person needs to live in my neighborhood. I don't think this person needs to have a loan in that amount. So it shows up, here's another way, and I'm not sure if that, so coincidentally, and I'm not going to say this was, so it shows up in microaggressions. I'm going to call this a microaggression of a well-meaning person. So my daughter is in middle school. She's a 7th grader, and everybody's on Zoom. And my daughter, literally, she has I'm not bragging. I am bragging. She has straight A's and a couple of A pluses. And she's on Zoom, and she gets there early. And yesterday was February 1st. And, we live in a predominantly white neighborhood, and she goes to a predominantly white school. And she's the first on Zoom, and her teacher, she's in the 7th grade. And her teacher says, such and such, did you know that today is the first day of Black History Month? And, my daughter's not this already, she told me she turned her camera off. I said, did you ever say anything to the teacher? She said, no, I didn't. It's already, and I know the teacher meant well. I know she meant well. I know she was trying to connect.
Absolutely.
But it's already hard for Black students, whether you go to a predominantly white school or not. When that Black History Month, because when I grew up, I went to a predominantly Black school. We talked about Harriet Tubman, we talked about slavery, we talked about Martin Luther King, and that was it. And it was very hard because this was the history that I was taught. And so when you're the only Black student or one of 2 Black students in a class, it's rough during Black History Month. And so so that's a small microaggression and know that again, I know she meant well, but these are the little things. So,
those things add up. Those microaggressions over and over for your whole life. They add up.
Yeah.
It's so funny that you mentioned that. Earlier this week, somebody posted on LinkedIn something about, it was an original picture of Madam C.J. Walker. And this a white lady that I've come in contact with, so I know she meant well. She literally was like, yeah, let's do this. And she goes, yeah, we need to uncover those hidden gems of Black history. And I was like, oh. So poor baby. Oh, you muted. I sent her a link of like the Netflix thing, but like a clip of it. I was like,
she's been discovered already. But thank you. We thank you.
So this one I'm talking about as far as on the receiving end, offering the grace and the understanding, and trying to find ways to also to share, to correct. But yeah. So these are again, we talk about health system and the criminal don't say criminal justice, but the criminal legal system. How for whatever reason, people of darker skin need to receive additional force when being handled by the police because I don't know, they don't feel pain. We don't feel pain. We need to be subjugated harder when it comes to women in delivery or women in the hospital, not receiving the medication because we don't feel pain.
And that's straight from slavery, right? Like that is straight from it.
Absolutely. And again, we don't see this. We don't see these biases. We don't see these unconscious biases as, this part of the system of white supremacy or the residual effects of where we're at right now. But absolutely, that is what that is. So, changing the policies, working through educating our peers, our colleagues, having conversations like this on YouTube.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I'm glad we can have these conversations. I'm glad that the climate has brought us to a place where we can have these conversations right now.
Amen. All right. Now, before we move on to our second topic go ahead, feel free to drop any questions you may have for later on the show. We have our very popular segment, Ask a Black Person, and we'll be taking live questions from the chat if you like. We do have a few that have been submitted beforehand, so feel free to drop them in the chat. All right. So,
Brooke, when you said that, a very controversial topic, I felt like there was going to be this boom coming where this Black person, Black.
No, I call it the controversial subject because when I told people about it, I was like, hey, what if I had a segment called Ask a Black Person? They were like, I don't know. Some people were straightforward. More Black people were okay with it. White people were like, oh, oh, okay, you're gonna have that. It's like, that's it. That's the one.
But when we look at it, it's controversial because where we're at right now. But if it was women asking, wanting to know about how the man thinks for heterosexual couples, ask a man. I mean, we've seen lots of shows and movies like that, right?
That's true. So true. Which further brings home our point about choosing to live an inclusive lifestyle. Learn
Absolutely.
a little bit more about who you are inside and versus who you want to be at the Bias Rehab. Go ahead and hit that like, share, and subscribe button, or leave a comment down below if you're enjoying the show. All right, so our second topic for today: cultural accountability. Now, when you think of cultural accountability, what first comes to your mind, Dr. Lewis?
I think about management. I think about management, creating an environment to whereas people want to be accountable for their actions. And I think if you're saying culture of accountability. And so I'm thinking about the environment where people want to do right. People want to be responsible for their actions. So when talking about within the space of furthering equity. And I'd like to talk about, we talked about, system of white supremacy. How do we get out of that? How do we transition as a country, as a society? And, we've talked about, DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really, at the crux of it is furthering equity and getting to equity. And so I think we talk about a culture of accountability. How can I, at my job or at anyone's job, how can I be responsible and be accountable for helping my colleagues progress? How can I do my part, and how can I be accountable to that? And so it's about I would think creating systems within that company to reduce inequities, to actually help BIPOC in the company. If you have BIPOC at your company, there are plenty of I'm finding there are plenty of diverse organizations that when we look at them, they're not as diverse as we thought that they were, depending on if I'm the owner.
Now, let me ask you, because thinking about most people, if you're just an average employee, sometimes creating a system at your job can be a little hard. If certain things are done a certain way, like changing everybody else to fit in your way can be sometimes challenging. And especially now everybody's working from home. So you're like basically telling somebody how to live in their own house. Which, I'd be like, who is this? You ain't telling me. So break that down for us. Like, what do you think a system would be, or is there like a call out procedure? Like what's an example of like one really simple thing that people could do?
That's a great question. So I'm working with this company. And again, it starts with one individual or two people trying to, and again, if it's not the CEO of that company, an advocate, who's also an ally, who wants to see change, who's been inspired, and then, convincing the CEO to accept, let's do something together as a company. So this particular individual, what they're doing on a micro level, they have a table. They set up a table in their office, a table where they put diverse items on, to educate, books, information about different communities, information, statistics, any way that they can, cultural items, educating their colleagues. In this case, they educate their colleagues about Juneteenth, and they acknowledge that day. And again, this was spearheaded by one or two employees. And so it just takes one or two employees and the stamp of approval from leadership. And you can start with little things like that. So the table, it's not forcing anybody to do anything, but they're doing their part, which leads to additional programming, which leads to policies, which leads to change, which leads to hiring, which leads to equity, as far as, pay equity in jobs and leadership. So it's one of 10 or 15 steps, but this person is taking that first step.
Okay.
So what I heard you say was that when we think about this type of change, like there has to be leadership engagement, like there has to. So me, at whatever position I am in an organization, like absolutely, I can take steps to, as you said, like start my little micro revolution. But if we are really going to impact and affect change, like we need to have something that's coming from leadership, that's coming from the top of the organization, and then trickling down throughout the organization. If we're talking about culture transformation.
Absolutely, both in, but definitely there has to be buy-in from the top for it to be sustainable and for it to actually have the resources behind it to further the change. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, here's one question I don't think that is often discussed enough. If you're on the reverse end, if you're like the teacher who suddenly discovers that February 1st is the beginning of Black History Month, how do you receive new information and like kind of withhold that urge to want to tell other people about the new information that you just found out about?
That's a great question. You know, it's funny. I'm laughing because I was I was on the receiving end of someone who I thought had known that information. It wasn't that specific example, but it was a similar example that I thought that this person should have known because of the space that this person is in, and they didn't know, and they broadcast their new knowledge as an example that they were glad that they had learned the knowledge, and I wasn't. I think. I don't think that you brought if this knowledge that you. I guess the question is, did you know that you were the only person? Did you know that this is information that you probably should have known? I mean, if it's the information that you probably should have known, I wouldn't tell anybody. But I would definitely share with others, depending on what type of knowledge it is, or I would just kind of, if I learned that, February was, has been known as Black History Month, I wouldn't probably broadcast it. If it's a holiday that's been going on for years, a month that's been going on for years, I'd probably definitely increase my knowledge. And, if I come across, something that happened in 2020 that my colleagues, were not aware of, I may share that. But I probably wouldn't broadcast because I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it's also good to acknowledge, individual growth, because then you can also bring other people around, and people should not be ostracized or demonized or made to feel a particular way if they're just now coming into knowledge. So at the same time, because someone will share that information, when someone does share the information, we have a responsibility to, again, provide grace, provide understanding, and help them along, because they're when someone shares with you, I just learned that, February is Black History Month. I just learned about, Madam C.J. Walker. I just learned about, whatever. These, people are coming with excitement. And again, regardless of one's ethnic background, people are coming with excitement. And for those on the receiving end, we have to embrace that, or we have to, acknowledge their part of that. That's where they're in their journey. And we all are on particular journeys, and we all are learning in different spaces. We're all in different spaces in our journey. We're all learning different things on our journey. So that's where those people are at in their journey. And we're also on a journey somewhere that if we went and announced somewhere that we just learned this, and again, we would probably be experiencing the same thing. You're just now finding that out. So.
And I just feel like I like what you said, that we need to be gracious. Like we need to be gracious. And I would just say, like, to add to that, I think that white people should be gracious towards us, because I think sometimes Black people don't feel empowered. When people, like, when you're approached with, especially like microaggressions, and people say things that's just like a little bit questionable, and you're kind of taken aback, but you don't say anything because the person had good intentions. And so you're just like, okay, turn the screen off or whatever, right? And you don't address it. And the only reason why I say it's like, if someone does address it to a white person who says something, like, you should be gracious toward that Black person, because, right, again, like microaggressions, we experience them daily, by the minute, like over and over again. And I just think, for Black people, we need to start, in a gracious manner, asking, like, well, what did you mean by that? Or you said this, like, why would you say something like that to me? Because if we don't start to say those things back, then they truly don't know. They just don't know, and they can't. If they don't know, how can they change? How can we bring about change? So I do think there needs to be that dialogue between people, with a lot of grace, right, on both ends, so that we can move towards change.
And that's that culture of accountability. I mean, having the and I use empowerment differently, but yeah, in case depending on the power relationship, but having the ability to be able to do that in the workplace and not feel like you're going to lose your job or not feel like you're going to be penalized for that, that the leadership creates that culture of accountability, that if you can, if someone is sharing that, and if you don't, if it makes you feel some kind of way, you should be able to dialogue. I agree with you 100%. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we got a message in the chat that we have some people that get sent a different link, and I'm so sorry. Excuse me. We had an upgraded link donated to us by Beyond Normal Podcast, and so we had a small last minute change, and I am sincerely sorry if you've missed, and hopefully you got a chance to join us and watch us afterwards, and then I'll never do that ever again. So please forgive us. Okay. So before we head into the Ask a Black, or actually, let me ask: did you, Faith? Did you have anything else you wanted to go into, or Dr. Harriet, Dr. Lewis? Excuse me. Did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation. I mean, we can talk. I mean, there are so many things that we can touch on. I mean, we're talking, 400 years plus of history, domestic and global. That's entrenched in our policies, that's entrenched in our soil, in our DNA that we have to work through.
Yeah, I heard somebody say like this was the greatest human experiment of all times. Like that it has persisted for centuries and centuries.
I think this experiment, it's unique in that it's chattel slavery, and it's all of the policies that are tied to chattel slavery and the Jim Crow and the Black codes. And even when we think about Isabel Wilkerson's book, I mean, it's a caste system that we don't talk about, that our existence has been, that we have this caste system in the United
States. Which book is that? Just for our audience, we want to make sure that they know.
Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Yeah, and she talks about our system here in the United States as being a caste system, and it's virtually a caste system. We have to talk about and think about it that way. But at the same time, even though this experience is unique, I mean, in many ways, when we look around the world, different countries, different regions have different yet similar, and sometimes I like to think about our experience is unique, but at the same time I also know, and I don't want to assume, well, I can't think of the word right now, but assume that our experience is any different or more tragic than other people's experience in different periods of time in different parts of the world, because there are oppressed people all around the world in many different countries during many different centuries. So I do want to acknowledge that as well. So yeah, our experience is definitely unique right now, but I'm not sure if it's unique along with others. I want to say that.
So, I mean, for some of that, would you say that a lot of that is a result of like colonialism? So like it is a different branch, but kind of the same tree as we look globally.
Yeah. I was just talking about even like during, different centuries, a 7th century or
I got you.
Yeah, 15th century. Yeah.
That's crazy. Well, Dr. Lewis, before we switch over to the Q&A, would you tell people how they can find you? And what sort of unique things you have going on right now?
Oh, wow. What kinds of unique things? I just launched, as you mentioned in your intro, I just launched an online on-demand course Know the Terrain is the platform. It's an on-demand course called Encouraging Equity, a primer, and it has 5 modules. 5 modules, and the modules are history of systemic racism, unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, allyship, and corporate vision. It's targeted actually to small business owners and entrepreneurs. It's really targeted to the entrepreneur. So, and you know, I like to say it's a new year. It feels like it feels like a new year in two ways. You know, we're still in COVID, and so the year's kind of blended, but at the same time, there is this energy after 2021. I'm not sure if the both of you felt it. It felt like, you know, everything was, you know, is moving really, really fast. And so I've been, you know, hearing chatter, myself included, you know, there's people wanting to do more, wanting to get back into the mix with opportunities. So things have been moving in lots of different things. As you know, I focus on inclusion, equity. My company, Connaissance Development, focuses on inclusion and equity through international trade, CSR, DEI, capacity building support, as well as tourism research. So we've been seeing movement in all of those areas this year.
Excellent.
Thank God.
Yes, and I agree. I do see some real change happening for 2021. For those who are interested, I went ahead and typed in the name of the book that Dr. Lewis recommended and the link to her class, so you can go ahead and follow up with her. Feel free to reach out to Dr. Lewis. Is LinkedIn your what's the best way to reach you? Best way for people to reach you?
LinkedIn is good. Oh, but LinkedIn's kind of hard because it's actually LinkedIn /Connaissance Research. It's not Harriet Lewis. That's one way. My email is fine as well.
Okay. If you want to type in your email, I'm going to let you give away your contact information, but I put the link.
The other easiest way is probably to go to my website. There's a contact page, and just send a note. I get that contact information. It gets to me.
Excellent. Okay. Now that I can do. I'll put the name of her company in the chat, and that way, even as playback, people should be able to look that up later.
Yes, connaissancedevelopment.com.
All right. So, all right, and now for the best premiere. My favorite. So we're now officially in the Ask a Black Person. So before I go to the questions that have been sent in, we've actually got a question here in the chat that I think is a really great way to branch off and to warm us up here. So nope, that's not the wrong. Here we go. How can recruiters navigate bias and to disrupt the hiring process, especially Black recruiters?
How do recruiters navigate biases?
Yes. So we have quite a few HR representatives, HR professionals that we're associated with. One in particular working with Destiny Recruiting. And so I do see here, like, when they're navigating that process, when you are an HR recruiter and your client who's paying you comes up to you with a question like, where do we find Blacks? You know, or how do we get more Blacks in here? We need some Latinos. How do you navigate that balance between keeping the client and you want money, right? And then helping them to understand how incredibly, utterly offensive that is.
Yeah, we do acknowledge that it is offensive, but we also understand if they're coming from a place of we need to further equity, that we want to do our part, that you know, this employer perhaps has been inspired in this moment, and they realize that their company is not as diverse and they're not as inclusive and they're not furthering equity as much as they could, and so they want to hire. But yes, they do have their own biases. Understanding what, you know, where I think that the Black recruiters can help them first to understand where they've gone wrong. You know, what have been the challenges in existing, you know, processes? Have they only gone to one place? Have they only, you know, sought from specific colleges? where have they been doing their recruiting originally, and then begin with that. This is our benchmark. This is where we're starting, and begin the education process. This is where you can build from. Let's go to these colleges. Let's look at these other associations where we can recruit from. Let's broaden our questions. And so I think that's how a recruiter can begin to educate a client on what they need to on what they can do better as it relates to the recruitment process, and also educate them on the biases that exist within their system as it stands.
Mm.
And Brooke, I would just say, quite frankly, like I would rather a leader say, like, we need more Blacks, as opposed to we need more diverse candidates, meaning we need more Black people, right? But not actually saying. So if you could say, like, we need more Black people, or we need more Latinx people in here, like, I can get the job done better for you, as opposed to you saying, like, we need more people of color, but what you really mean is we need more Black people, but you're not saying that specifically. So when I deliver something else, you're like, oh, actually, we needed Black people. And you gave us Asian, Indian, Hispanic, whatever. So I say what you need, say what you're really looking for.
And that's what I'm hearing, and maybe you're hearing the same thing. I think in this moment that we're in right now, in this space that we're in right now, people are not saying they're not saying we need people of color. They're specifically saying we need to hire more Blacks. We want to fund more Black organizations. We want to fund Black leadership. We want to support Black businesses. People are being direct. So but that's not what I heard in the question. The question, I think, was how to navigate, how to provide education to that employer as well. But yeah, I think that employers are more direct as well.
So what I'm hearing then is that, would you say that people, at least in the workplace profession, just say it with your chest, like just say it and don't be scared about the consequences?
What do you mean? You mean as far as what you're wanting to do, or what type of change that you're wanting to implement?
Yeah, or like, don't be afraid to say that you want all Blacks or Hispanics or Latinx, or like just jump in.
I think it depends on your environment and all. I mean, it depends on your environment. Again, as it depends, if this is your only job and you have to navigate that. I think it depends on your leadership as well. I think, again, one of my clients, they are gung ho. They are wanting to, they know they need more diversity in their company. They are trying to create systemic change it's a long-term strategy that will eventually create a pathway towards equity and more diversity in their company, but they're trying to start. So I think you have to understand the leadership. Some environments you can say, yeah, we want to hire, 3 Black people and 2 of them will be in senior leadership. Some places you have to identify a way to create a pipeline. You have to develop an internship program. You have to, to create a policy that creates opportunities for sponsorship and for mentorship in a company. You have to expand your C-suite so that there are a couple of spaces for Blacks, for African Americans to move into. So you have to, it's about being creative and knowing your environment.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome answers. Awesome answers. Okay. So now this really great question we received by email. They asked to be anonymous. So they said, the question is, what can I do as a white woman to learn more about where I am? I'm in Wisconsin. What can I do to find more Blacks? It says African Americans, but I'm going to say Blacks. She's in Wisconsin. So she's a white woman and she wants to know what can she do to find more blacks in Wisconsin or to be closer to the black culture. I'll translate that to say.
Go to Milwaukee.
Okay.
Okay, you beat me to the buzzer. You beat me to the buzzer. It was in my head. I didn't know that I had to press the buzzer. Okay, so I missed the points there, but I'm going to come out and say that was not the top answer. So, so I'm going to say that if we're playing Family Feud, yours is like number 2. No, yours is probably number 1, actually, but I'm going to come in with my response. I was going to say, because we're in COVID, and there are a lot of opportunities to connect. I think, there's probably an NAACP chapter there.
Ooh.
There are probably some sororities, but I mean, specifically as it relates to NAACP, that would be the first welcoming environment, I think, that this person can connect to. And I was saying, because we're in this COVID space, a lot of people's doing Zoom. There are a lot of Zoom, webinars, a lot of Zoom meetings, and that person can connect to the NAACP there, and there may be a Zoom meeting that they can connect to and start developing relationships. I mentioned that, but there are probably other Black organizations in Wisconsin that they can connect to.
You think?
Yeah,
that would be great.
I was thinking about other, sororities and Masons and other others, but I'm sure that these exist. That was actually advice that I'd given to a Black woman who was relocating to a rural community in Wisconsin, and I was saying, and in the event that she began to feel a little isolated, my advice to her was find the local or the nearest NAACP, find the nearest AME church, if she's
go to a church. Because Black church people will welcome you in. Like they will welcome you in no matter your race, creed. Like they would be very welcoming. I think that would be a safe space.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. And so for her, being a white woman, she'll still be great, like hugely accepted and embraced. You think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Don't everybody swallow Okay. Let's see if we have any more questions. We did get Ralph really enjoyed your answer. Yeah. And they're gonna replay this later. That is all the questions that we had from Oh, here's one. Well, this is more of a statement. Columbus and his captain said our hospitality is our weakness. Do you have any response to that?
I don't have a response. I've never heard that, but I think I've heard that statement before. I'm not sure. I've never heard who was attributed to. I would definitely, as far as the indigenous of this land that we're on right now, that we always continuously need to pay homage to. Yeah, the hospitality was the weakness and the detriment to the indigenous population and the beginning of the enslavement of Africans. I'm sorry?
Should we stop being nice and hospitable?
No, I think the reference to was historically that, Columbus, I think the person was referring to Christopher Columbus. Mm-hmm. But I'm not, but your question is, should we stop being hospitable? I think we need to learn how to be hospitable. I think it depends on who you're talking to as far as hospitality and who's welcome to this country and what people have had to do over the years historically in order to feel welcome. I mean, I'm talking about even people from Europe who had to change their names and hide their identity and become white American in order to fit in and, change the way they spoke and use American vernacular in order to become white. Because in Europe, no one was white. So so that hospitality, even when I think about that time period, that population of white people did not feel that the Italians, Polish, Irish, this was not a hospitable country at that time period either.
Very true. Very true. And what did you say earlier, Faith? I missed that. I'm so sorry.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, but I think we should I think, hospitality is who we are, right? Like that's, as Dr. Lewis just said, like the Africans were hospitable, the indigenous people were hospitable. Like that is who we are. That is in our DNA. I don't think that we should change that. We should be who we are. But as you said, like we should, we might need to be careful. And then I would hope that, as Dr. Lewis talked about before, that white people would not continue to take advantage of our hospitality, but be gracious towards us. So when we're welcoming them into our spaces, that they allow us to continue to be centered, and not take up too much space.
I didn't say exactly that, but
you said gracious. I was talking about the grace part.
No, I get what you said, but I do want to say that I was actually talking about a moment in time. I took when I was reading the notes from the message. I was thinking about just this country. I was thinking about that person was talking about a point in time in our history as a nation, and I was thinking about how this nation has not always been hospitable. And I was thinking about even now, today, there are certain populations that this country as a nation, as our policies, the policies that exist, have not always been hospitable. That's what I was referring to. But yes, different groups of people have been too hospitable, and we should continue that hospitality in order to connect, in order to help people to understand and to develop strong relationships. But I was just responding to that and thinking about our nation and our
no, I got it. I was taking the question or the statement that she was making related to when we were talking about like going to Black churches or going to where Black people are, that we would welcome them in, because that's just our way. But sometimes we can't be too hospitable. So I was kind of taking it from there. But I got you. We're on the same page now.
We're all together.
It's funny because that's how communication is, and we're talking about we have to dialogue, we have to provide grace, and we have to ask questions. We have to, because sometimes I could say something and you hear something completely different. You say something, I hear something completely different, or we may read the same thing and interpret it completely different. And so we have to continue this conversation and again be gracious, provide some grace and some understanding, and understand the intent of who we're speaking with in order to get there, because it may take a few times.
Mm-hmm. But it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We all get there together.
Absolutely.
Man, that's deep. All right. So that is a great end to the show. We don't want to keep you long. We're not going to hold you. We're bold, brief, and gone. Be bold, be brief, be gone, they say. So we want to thank you for joining us here on No Invitation Required. We want to invite you back to next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Standard here at the Bias Rehab. We'd like to thank our co-host, Faith Eatman, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Faith. Yay. And we want to thank the illustrious Dr. Harriet Lewis, PhD, for coming in today and for your incredible wisdom. Thank you. Thank you. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And this has been No Invitation Required from the Bias Rehab Center, your safe space to learn, to ask, to grow. Good night, everybody.